Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm excited to have Bill Hartman and Chris Wicus as this week's guests. Bill is a physical therapist and an in-demand educator. Bill's model has influenced thousands of coaches, therapists, and performance specialists, as well as many guests who have been on this podcast. Chris Wicus is a health and performance professional with 15 years of experience, is a former pro ultimate frisbee player, as well as a second-degree black belt in karate. He's worked with a wide variety of athletes and has been mentored by many of the top experts in the field. Together, Bill and Chris host the Reconsider podcast. On the show today, Bill and Chris will be talking about fitting the big lifts, and specifically we'll be getting into the deadlift the most, but fitting those lifts to the athlete, so to the elastic or the narrow infrasternal angle archetype of athlete, or the wide or the muscular or the wide infrasternal angle archetype of athlete. How do we give those athletes the lifts that are based on their own path of least resistance? And in doing so, set them up for higher performances and better longevity. This and so much more, and excited to get this show going. Let's get on to episode 430 here with Bill Hartman and Chris Wicus. Bill, Chris, it's fantastic to have you two here. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us. Excited to talk about stuff.
Yeah, I'm really curious. I've been listening to the Reconsider podcast that you two do a lot. I was mentioning I actually had to stop listening to it at night because it was hard to turn my brain off before going to bed. I'm curious how you two got together. So what's the backstory of you two, and how did you get together, and how did the podcast come about? Just curious with all that.
When did you get sick? Was that after? Was that the second? That was after. I wanted. Well, so first, I kind of want to see if Bill can remember, because I have no idea. Yeah, Bill has no idea. So I used to work in New York City at a gym called Drive 495 with one of Bill's former students by the name of Connor Ryan.
Connor, okay, that's right.
And I had learned a bunch of things. Sort of, Bill and I had attended similar courses and had sort of, certain perspectives that seemed coherent. And Connor just kept telling me that I needed to talk to Bill, and the way that I was talking and things that I was thinking were like very would agree with what Bill was thinking. And, I'd heard of Bill and had read some of Bill's stuff and heard him on podcasts and seen him present and such. But I never had met him or reached out. And I think I went to a course in Connecticut that was put on by the Omega Wave people and Val and Nisedeking.
Yeah. Okay.
And I just went up to Bill, and I think I said something like, I heard you like Batman, and Batman's one of my favorite comic book heroes. And we just started talking about that. And I think we made a connection based on that. I went out to Indy for a course, and I got the worst food poisoning that I've ever gotten.
It's a horrible week. You just look so bad. Maybe it's like sorry for you or something.
Yeah. So that was the sympathy. I think the sympathy sort of allowed me to Bill felt bad enough to kind of take me under his wing, and I was on the short list of people that maybe could have gone to the first intensive, which is like the course that Bill puts on for small groups of people, and I didn't get invited to that. But Bill also felt bad about that and gave me a mentorship spot with him.
Yeah, we hung out at the Reckoning a little bit.
Yeah. We that, and then I was one of your mentees for several years, I think, and we just sort of decided after a while that I was going to try to do like a program for people. And you said like, hey, why don't we just do it together? And then we kind of started our business partnership after that.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that I only trust a few people. This is true. This is very true. There's I have had long-term, I have a long-term business partner, which means that I trust him a great deal. And it's like when you meet Chris, the brutal honesty is something that I appreciate to no end, because I have a brother, and the reason that I appreciate him is because he will call me on my stuff, and then Chris is no different than that. And I can't tell you how how much I appreciate that. And I think that's one of the reasons why we get along so well, is because I trust him implicitly. Like I know that we each have our best interests towards one another at heart here. And so again, that's why this works. But Chris is like dangerously smart in so many different ways that people don't like. He hides, right? He hides behind all of it.
I'm the guy at the computer. If you know anything about comic books,
it's like, okay, all right. Since we talked about Batman, like there's the superhero guy that goes out there, and then there's like the person that sits behind the computer and like feeds him information and stuff. It's like that's kind of like Chris kind of hides a little bit, right? So yeah, I talk a lot, and then Chris gets unfortunately none of the glory that goes with our business.
Okay, I don't want it anyways.
That is true. You don't want.
Yeah. And then the Reconsider podcast was something that I think Bill was we were talking about something one time and we were really getting into it. And Bill was like, we should record this. Bill kept saying that over and over again during our mentorship calls. He'd be like, we should be recording this. And then eventually I was like, let's just do that. And from the perspective of a lot of people have misconceptions about things in health and performance. And we wanted to sort of allow for people to reconsider that, and wanted that to sort of coincide with the program that Bill and I were creating with the Recon program. And then that sort of parlayed into, trying to help the general population, but then also figuring out a way to help the practitioners. So then we created the UHP network. And that's kind of like where we kind of live in this circle now of podcast, programming, training, educating practitioners.
Yeah, I like the dynamic you two have on the Reconsider podcast, especially, Chris, the questions you ask Bill. I watch all the a lot, I shouldn't say all, there's a lot of YouTube videos out there. I really like the dynamic that you two have and the questions that you ask, and like, especially like clarifications, because those are always so helpful to me. Like, and it's just been a great experience for me so far. I did want to, speaking of like Batman, I've kind of been on this like hero's journey kick. I just showed The Karate Kid to my kids who are 6 and 8 for the first time. Like I'm all into like that story. And I know you guys have talked about Batman as well with like the wide ISA, narrow ISA, proportion, things like that. It's always entertaining. I'm curious of your own journeys as it pertains to what we'll be talking about today, narrow and wide ISA or infrasternal angles, elastic or muscular. I'm sure more broad terms you could kind of paste onto that in a way, and how it pertains to the big lifts, the power lifts. What have been your journeys in getting in, the lifting, going down the lifting rabbit hole, and then learning about your own bodies in the process, and how has that impacted your viewpoints on this whole equation?
Do you want to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
So I used to be really big and really strong. For me, big and strong for me. So like
for most people.
Yeah. It's like I was about 60 pounds heavier than I am now, actually, at one point. So, and it was the 80s and the 90s. And so, you grew your hair into a mullet and you lifted weights and you got really big because bodybuilding was everything. Joe Weider magazines were prolific. And so that was like, it wasn't about performance back then. It was more about just getting into the gym and lifting and lifting and lifting. And so that was my background. That sort of was, where I started in college. I was working in a really small facility, working with some people, but mostly just training myself at that point. And so it was just about pushing the numbers upward, which teaches you a lot about how to lose mobility, like a great deal. But it was not a concern. In fact, it's not much of a concern when you're entirely concerned about force production and building cross-sectional muscle mass. There will be a sacrifice. There will be a sacrifice in movement, because to actually produce that degree of hypertrophy or the maximum amount of force, there is the trade-off. It's always a trade-off. So hard lesson to learn. Didn't really know I was learning it at the time, but hindsight provides a tremendous amount of education in regards to what the effects are of those activities. Not concerned about the structure at that point, short of like, does this look good, kind of a thing, right? Like, does the muscle mass look good? Does my tank top fit? That kind of thing, right? So all of those lessons, though, they weren't learned at the time other than pure execution. But from a consequential standpoint, that provided me a great deal of education of what to expect and then how to apply it. And then as you get a little bit smarter about things and you start working with more and more people, you can start to see the potential for the secondary consequences, both good and bad. And so I think that's where the value lies for me, having been through that, like having really tried to push the limits of what I was capable of doing, like compared to like the highest level of guys. It's like, don't even touch that. But, squat 500 pounds one time and you've officially squatted 500 pounds. Right. And very few people can say that.
What's the question? The question is like my personal like training journey experience.
Yeah. Through the big lifts, basically through the big lifts, and then
through the big lifts.
On the way out, yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Like I think what Bill hit on about hindsight is it's really cool to look back and think about all of the injuries I had and what type of training helped me and what things hurt me. And Bill and I joke about this a lot. Like him and I are pretty much the two ends of the continuum when it comes to narrow and wide. It's like I'm like 6'4". I've always been sort of, skinny fat my whole life, like pretty flexible in my youth, martial arts background, always better at longer distance running than sprinting, always better at like momentum based stuff than starting and stopping. Would always hurt myself doing, deadlifts from the floor, but never from like a hanging position, things like that. Like, learning the hard way through injury that if I stopped running, like there were certain parts in my athletic career, like coming from like a longer distance running background, getting into into ultimate frisbee for a while, which I was fairly competitive at like the national and world level. The more I would play and sprint and do track workouts, the better I would be as an athlete. The more I lifted, like there were several seasons early on when I was a young, stupid kid where I thought, oh, hey, I'm just going to lift for 3 months and not run anymore. And that was the worst I've ever felt. And the most injured I ever got was because I was going against my nature of like wanting to be a momentum based individual, stay springy and bouncy off of the ground. I was just dragging myself into the floor, tons of time under tension, tons of time in a place where, I wasn't really able to express what I was good at athletically. So I paid the price for it, hamstring issues and different muscle pulls and whatnot. So yeah, it's like you start to transition from like, okay, well, I'm really good at like hang cleans and not cleans from the floor. So I'll just do hang cleans, or like then you start realizing that like the more I lift in the gym, the worse I feel. So then I start just running more. And by the end of my athletic career, it was just mostly sprinting and running and not so much of like the slow grindy stuff. Cause that was the stuff that always hurt me anyways. I didn't really know why. It was just sort of an experience.
As it should, based on your
Yeah, exactly. Now it makes perfect sense to me in hindsight. But back then it was like having, there are a lot of reasons why people get into coaching and stuff like I did, or what Bill does, is they have a history of getting hurt and no one was able to help them, and they were sort of able to help themselves, and they figure out like a better way to do it. And they want to sort of impart that knowledge to other athletes and help other people. And that was exactly my situation, is like learning the hard way.
Yeah, I like, part of the reason I asked that too is I think from a frame of reference point, Bill speaking as a wide infrasternal angle and you, Chris, as a narrow. I think there's that dynamic too. It's interesting to think about what makes a dynamic duo in a sense, right? Like the different qualities or ends of the spectrum. And I know, I was just thinking about ultimate frisbee as well. I'd imagine there's not a lot of, and for people who are familiar, I imagine a lot of people listening are at least relatively familiar with the archetypes, but I would imagine you don't get a lot of wide YSAs in ultimate frisbee on a high level, because it's like that's kind of against the sport. It's almost like if you want to say, here's a sport that is very definitive of a narrow ISA archetype, and maybe that could even be a little lead in just for redefinition. We never don't want to redefine it a million times, but just for people who aren't familiar, maybe that's a good lead in.
So if you look at sport in general, the Olympics, the Olympics having just gone by not too long ago, is always a great example because you're looking at the highest level of performance in a specific context, and so then you start to see like, oh, there's a selection towards very specific body types. So, and the thing I always use is because you can see them because they don't wear a whole lot as the swimmers. It's like they do this introduction of all the swimmers on the blocks, and if they didn't have like a different flag on their head, you wouldn't know who is who because the body type is so similar. There's a very specific body type. There's a very specific structure that makes you really, really good at swimming. We kind of talked about this off the air, so to speak, a minute ago. It's like swimmers are very specifically designed to be very, very good at swimming. It's very difficult for a swimmer to convert into another sport because of their design. But you could go across the board. It's like you're not going to see these incredibly stocky, heavy, wide ISA pole vaulters. It just doesn't exist because that body type just doesn't select for the demands of that activity. You look at the difference between a 100-meter sprinter, an 800-meter runner, and then a 5K runner, and you're going to see this progressive difference in body type, even though they all might be defined as some form of runner, and there would be similarities. There are differentiators that make them very good at applying force very quickly to the ground, and versus trying to establish a measure of efficiency, which is what the biggest difference is when you start to see people adding distance. There's a structural difference that makes them crazy efficient at what they're doing. They're still running relatively fast to the average folks, but then the big differential will be between like the absolute sprinter and the distance runner. So there's always going to be a selection toward the constraints, which are the structure. It's like people will fall into things, if you will, because they find out that they're better at them. And it turns out that, okay, your foundational structure has a lot to do with this, right?
Yeah, I think remind me to come back to that because I had a question on helical angles, and I was just thinking about pole vaults. Like if you're wide, I say it's probably really hard to deal with the helical angle of a pole vault. Everything needs to go in the space in front of you. But if you're more of a wide, it will make sense more, I'm sure, when we talk about that. But to me, that's another interesting thing to note when you think about those things, because you look at spaces, and do I have access to space in front, space on the side? Am I a better bench presser or vertical presser? And how does that fit into my sport? And it's like, yeah, the more you know, the more it starts to make sense, and it just makes it more fun to watch. Like I when I go to sports games now, professional sports games, I probably spend 3/4 of the time just watching different like body structures and how they move and how they throw and operate. It's just that's what I find fun. But yeah, it's really interesting to note that with the different types.
Especially with team sports, it lends itself towards tactics. Like if you look at basketball and you look at the different physiques, right, the different structures within a basketball team, and you'll see like certain types of players. Like there's a certain type of player that plays strong down on the block. There's a certain type of player that is better on the periphery. There are body types that can move back and forth between those two representations, but then there'll be one that will be superior in one versus the other. And so you're always going to see that kind of thing.
Yeah. Or breakdance too. You're probably not going to see a lot of wide ISAs of the breakdancing the one year it was at the Olympics.
Maybe that's what my problem was back in the 80s.
Yeah. You never made it as a b-boy, Bill, because
I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, the ultimate frisbee. So what you had mentioned about like spaces that are available. If you have a sport that's predicated on a lot of the ability to rotate easily. So if you having to throw, like, if you know anything about throwing a frisbee, like having to sort of coil and uncoil your body to do that. A lot of the throwing takes place overhead. So if you are wide, it's a lot harder to access that space. So that's, you end up with a bunch of, you look at the starting line of an ultimate frisbee team at like a top level team, and you're going to have 7 players who are all like 6'2", 185. Like they look exactly the same. Like you couldn't really, they're all very compressed narrows. And that's just like Bill is saying, it's the people that it sort of gets selected. It's a natural selection over the course of your career. By the time you hit your peak when you're 23 years old in the frisbee world, like those are the people that haven't really gotten hurt over and over again and are good at that thing. It's just they've gravitated towards it.
Yeah. Of all the like abilities, or if my body type, which is neuro ISA, long arms, throwing a frisbee was one of the things that came the most easily and naturally to me. And I used to play a fair amount of disc golf in my early 20s. It was just like my thing. I love being in nature and that kind of thing. And I took a 3-month break at about age 22, 23, I read Charlie Francis's stuff on, all right, after 7 years, you need to take like 1 year easy, or it's hard to continue progress, or all this. And I was just like, I need a break from lifting and anything heavy, or even sprinting and plyos or any of that stuff. And so I just basically did nothing except for play disc golf for 3 months. And my driving distance like just got better and better and better and better. And I guess at the time I was just like, okay, it's just specialization, but it's like, well, it's also more than that, because everything I do that smushes me is kind of taking away my ability to spin like a top. And right. Of course, here I am like over 15 years later, and it very perfectly makes sense with that. But I think that's a good lead into the big lifts, because like that Ultimate Frisbee team, a very typical strength and conditioning program where fitness is ubiquitous with pressing ability. I'm going to take that team and press them, and of course, yes, we want to do some level of pressing. We just want to do it in a way that doesn't take away your superpowers or abilities. And so with that all being said, so with the big lifts, like squat, deadlift, bench, maybe we can start there and we can certainly expand out. But what should we be aware of from spaces available, infrasternal angle? That's a really broad question. So maybe let's just start with infrasternal angle and what that means for, let's just say, squatting and deadlifting. Start there. We can get to pressing just to keep it.
Can I offer a starting point for this?
Sure. Yeah, please.
I think if Bill were to maybe explain both ends of the continuum of structural archetypes, I think it's important to understand the starting points for the two and what both the superpowers of each extreme, because that will help direct like which lifts will be more interference for which archetype.
That'd be perfect. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, so at all measures of scale in a human, all levels of scale. So down to your DNA. So DNA is structured helically. A collagen fiber is structured helically. All of your joints move on helical pathways. So we are helically designed. Okay. So orthogonal would be like a bunch of zeros and 90-degree angles, so a bunch of perpendiculars. And we are not structured that way, because if you're structured that way, you don't turn, you kink when you try to bend. And so it doesn't work well for humans. So our helical structure immediately gives us the power to change shape more effectively and much more efficiently. So we are designed this way. But we're not equivalent in our structures, in the fact that if I take a really steep helix, so it would be very narrow. It'd be like a very, very long, slender spiral, if you will. Okay. Or I could take a short and wide spiral, which would have a different frame of reference as far as what direction it would expand to the greatest degree. So one will expand more sideways, one will expand more vertically. You could look at it as a spring. So if I stretch the spring out, that would be a helix. That would be represented as narrow. If I compress the spring and it becomes more horizontal, that's going to be more expressed as a wide helix. And so we will have representations within all humans to a matter of degree. They're going to be biased in one direction or the other. So if we lined up 8 billion people and we went 2 by 2, we're eventually going to land on the person that is the widest of wides and the narrowest of narrows. And they will show us the extreme tendencies of the influence of structure. And so that's what this is all based off of. But everybody's going to be biased in one direction or the other. And it's relatively easy to identify. You don't have to get terribly complex with testing, but there's tendencies and behaviors that would follow that. Because of that, then our exercise selection can be much more effective, because we have natural tendencies that are going to be represented as we execute the lifts. So I will give you a quick for instance that will make a lot of sense to a lot of people. If I was to say that a wide ISA individual would be biased more towards being effective as a deadlifter, and a narrow ISA individual would be more effective as a front squatter. because of their physical structures and because of the biases within the exercises themselves that would lend towards certain elements of behavior or performance to execute them. So like a deadlift, you got to think about like, okay, there's a very high pressure strategy that's going to be associated with pulling weight off the floor when you think about like a maximum effort deadlift. The people that tend to be better deadlifters tend to be more stocky or wider in structure than your tall, slender folk that would look like a distance runner trying to pull a deadlift off the floor, right? The position of a weight in a front squat lends itself more towards the cylindrical behaviors because it'll be biased more towards being effective at the top of the squat and at the very bottom of the squat. The middle part of the squat has a bias towards the same structure that would be ideal for deadlifting. So this is why you would see think like a super heavyweight power lifter. It's like when they're doing their squat in competition, it looks a whole lot like a deadlift for a reason, is because that style, if we could still call it a squat, would be a whole lot like that middle range of the squat would be just like the initiation of a deadlift. Right. So again, you're going to see that physical structure that kind of biased this way. And so it's not that narrows can't do deadlifts, but we're going to make modifications that are going to make it more ideal. So Chris kind of hit on this a little bit earlier when he was talking about when I try to clean or deadlift from the floor, it doesn't work nearly as well as when I pull off of blocks or I do it from a hang, right? Because assuming that position it's very difficult for the narrow ISA individuals because they don't have the structural bias that allows them to create the appropriate shapes, which allows them to create the appropriate amount of internal pressure that they need to initiate those lifts. So like I said, it's not that we can't do these activities. We just have to look and say, how would this structure best execute? And we could build on that. Chris, you want to add to that since
I mean the starting points of the archetypes I think is important to understand for a lot of people, and it will help explain some of the things that Bill is saying, because Bill is talking about the bias towards expansion or the bias towards compression, and a lot of that comes down to actual structural starting points. So what I mean would be like the position of the sacrum relative on each side of the continuum here. So I have a narrow infrasternal angle individual who's going to have more of like an AP expansion from front to back, and they're going to have more of a counter-nutated sacrum that allows them to use that sort of pistoning action of straight up and down, versus a wide, which is going to be that more lateral, expanded, compressed from front to back, more nutated sacrum. So the path at which the guts can move down and into the pelvis is actually different. The orientation strategy from either the bottom up in order to move or the top down to move, which would be for wides and narrows respectively, that affects, like what Bill's saying, like that's why, your narrows are going to be more tuned to momentum based activities where they can use these sort of top down strategies that sort of meet up with how their body has developed. The starting points in which, as soon as they had to try to manage gravity, they were born, they learned to crawl. As soon as they're put into the gravity field, that starting structure will dictate the behavior and the path of compensation, or however you want to say it.
Joel, you kind of hit on this a little bit earlier when you were talking about the difference between like an overhead press versus the bench press. So when we talk about these helical structures, we'll see like the narrow ISA individual is going to have a more vertically oriented helix, which immediately makes them better at an overhead press than they would, say, something like a bench press, because our greatest excursion of movement is on our helical angle, and our greatest force production also occurs on our helical angle. And so, like I said, your taller, slender individual, they're going to be better at landmine pressing, overhead pressing. Your more horizontally oriented, wide ISA individual, because of the position of the load and the path of the bar, become much better at bench pressers. doesn't mean that they can never do the alternatives. It just means that where their strength is going to lie is going to be much closer to their structural design, which would again put them pressing on their helices.
Yeah, that's something that I never made too much sense to me until I learned about that helical angle piece. I mean, my best bench press would never light the world on fire. It was 240 at about 185 pounds, so not great. But my standing strict press with long arms, I mean, I'm 6'1" with a 6'6" wingspan, was 170. And I mean, that's a lot better respectively. And I always just was like, oh, I guess I'm just good at it, like, or relatively good, for someone of my body type. And thinking of that, it definitely makes a lot more sense. And these days, actually, my measure of upper body strength more so is like, can I do a handstand push-up against the wall? I'd rather, like, to me, that's more meaningful than like loading up a bench press bar. And I've already compressed my rib cage front to back so much from all those years of bench pressing. That's why I even mentioned before the show, I was really excited because I finally was able to use some of these principles, and I touched my hands together behind my back, the other day training. I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, with the pressure on the canister versus just, stretching it out. So anyways, yeah, that to be said, that was a big light bulb moment for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that people hear Bill talk about this stuff, or they learn about this model and they think, or they'll say things like, Bill says narrow should never deadlift. It's not what Bill's saying. But what we're trying to impart is there are going to be negative secondary consequences to the things that you just determined are useful for training. So bench pressing might help a narrow to a certain degree, and then might start to take away from that. But just based on the principles of like, if you're pressing and moving on an angle that's off of your helical angle, there's going to be some resistance and there's going to be some added pressure there that's outside of where you're supposed to naturally move. So there will be a trade-off. And that trade-off, if, for instance, like if you are a narrow pitcher and you decide to bench press and do chest supported rows a lot, there could be a potential negative trade-off down the line where you rob rotation and you have to ask your shoulder or elbow for more motion. And then you end up, needing a UCL surgery or having a shoulder pathology.
Right. Yeah, up to a point, the gain in force production can be beneficial from a performance perspective. So, and again, use the pitcher analogy because it's kind of easy to see. It's like, oh, you now throw harder. So you put 2 or 3 miles per hour on your fastball because of the compressive nature of the exercises that you're performing. But then again, you have to look at the secondary consequences. It's like, what did you give up? There's always going to be a trade-off because we all have limited resources. Anything that I gain in one realm, I'm going to sacrifice something else. And we have to say, it's like, okay, is that sacrifice worth the desired outcome? And then as managers, like those of us that do coaching, or as a therapist, it's like, it's up to us to determine. It's like, okay, are we moving in a favorable direction, or is the secondary consequence now magnifying to such a degree that we have to say, let's put the kibosh on that. We got to back this up a little bit and recapture something that we may have given up that is going to influence the health outcome.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the Athletic Development Games educational program. This program includes a video library of fun and engaging games aimed at kids ages 4 to 10 years old. In the program, you'll find activities for speed, coordination, jumping, and more, with new videos added each month. The games are fun, engaging, and they also invoke the imagination. It's given me great ideas already for my youth sports teams, as well as plenty of games to play with my own children. To sign up for the course, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app, and you can use the coupon code JUSTFLY, that's JUSTFLY with all caps, at checkout for an exclusive 50% off. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah. I wanted to dig in with, maybe we can look at deadlifting specifically. So really zero in on that, because I think that's a very, it's a very like polar thing, wides, narrows, deadlift. It's like zooming down to that. And I was always for a long time, I was always under the impression that a narrow or an elastic actually was a better, and I'll just say the word puller, but maybe not necessarily deadlifter. And in what I have seen, like Chris, maybe you said it, like pulling from a higher position. And I was always a better deadlifter by far than my squat. And I saw a lot of similar things. And it took a while to unpack why that was, because I'm a narrow. And I think it might be good to, not to make this too complex, but I like, the nutation and counter nutation in the sacrum. It's like, this is audio only. I don't want to make, keeping this pretty simple. I always looked at it took me a while to figure that out, but I like thinking about the idea of the sacrum. If it's like counter nutated, it's like angled forward and that throws everything forward. Like you go down and forward. And if it's nutated, it's down and everything can go straight down and back a little bit. It's almost like a directional changer or something. Like I was trying to think of easy ways to see it. But it
is a directional change, by the way.
Oh, what's that?
It is directional.
Yeah.
It is 1000% directional.
Yeah.
And
it changes pretty good. Yeah, it's a good explanation. It also just changes. I like to say, it just changes the starting point. So the first move that you're capable of making is different. That's why it's important for people to understand. It's the structure is not, everyone's not just like the same structure and they have the same progression of compensations. It's different actual starting points that are different from each other. And that will change the first step that you have to make in order to manage gravity. So that's something to understand. Because if you try to train everyone the same way or treat everyone the same way, then you end up running into these sort of problems because of it.
Yeah. But the thought I had, maybe this is the best way to explain it, is I like you talked about the extremes, and Bill, you talk right away about the extremes in the Olympics. And you mentioned with cross country, and maybe this is a good way of putting it, is like on the extremes, you see it really well in the sense of on one extreme, powerlifters, like you said, they hinge their squats. They're deadlifting their big lifts, the squats and deadlifts. They're basically just a hinge. And on the other end of things, cross country, one of the most humbling experiences in my strength and conditioning career was trying to coach. I had just a huge group. So it was like, hey, the whole cross country team come in the weight room at once. And I'm trying to teach 30 to 40 cross country runners. And of course, knowing what I did back then, age 29 or whatever it was, we're all doing deadlifts today. So I have 30 some cross country runners, and we're trying to teach them a straight bar deadlift. And you could not imagine a bigger train wreck and humbling experience on my end, because they just do not. I mean, some people can figure it out, compensate themselves in that space. This was like the ultimate exercise in futility, rounded back city, like me looking like I don't know anything, and of course my how I taught hinging or whatever, my progressions got a lot better from that day forward. But that was crazy. But yet, if I say that took that whole cross country team and said, hey, here's a 20-pound dumbbell, do a goblet squat. That's
I was just about to say that.
Very easy. So it's almost
that's like
when you have the athlete that like doesn't excel in the weight room, and you're like, what do I want to do hand cleans, but this person cannot hinge to save their life. What do they always end up doing? It's like goblet squat every time. Yeah.
But that person that you were dealing with probably had a lot of motion available to them. They didn't know how to control it. They were narrow. So you gave them the ability to put them within their base of support and allow them to drop straight down, up and down like they're designed to do. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, goblet squat works for everybody. But that's not like knowing now if I had known that back then, it makes a lot more sense. Yeah, but I was thinking as you were saying that, I was just thinking like, I guarantee it's just like everyone's doing goblet squats. It's self-limiting. It matches up with their archetype and it just works. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So teaching, I do want to get to this naturally. So teaching a narrow, okay, so we have a narrow and narrows and deadlifts. Where do we go? And I'll just say this from my own personal kind of story is I've had enough narrows through track and field especially, and you see their personal bests and jumps and sprints. And I've had plenty of athletes who get a lot better, like the Olympic lifts or RDLs or whatever. I didn't use straight bar deadlift really a ton with track, but like I mentioned, I did try at least with cross country, but I eventually got to this point where, especially like myself, even I stopped even doing RDLs because I'm like, I just don't see the transfer here anymore. I didn't know why. And I naturally catered towards front squat or like a deep catch clean and stuff like that just felt better. It felt like it was transferring. But how do you approach the middle? I'll say like my best deadlift came at age 32. I finally pulled over 4 plates on each side. But funny enough, I tested my max vertical about, I don't know, a month after that, and it was down like 4 inches. I mean, and it felt terrible. Like it was so bad. So obviously, how I was doing space didn't work with that max. So let's unpack
okay. That. So we sort of mentioned this is like, what did you just sacrifice? Yeah. Right. So here's what you need to be able to do to pull a weight off the floor. You have to create enough pressure internally to push into the ground enough to break the weight off the floor and move in the opposite direction. So you have to push the earth away. Okay. What does that take? Well, that means that you have to squeeze yourself harder and harder and harder. So the greater your capacity, the greater the capacity to create pressure superiorly relative to the ground, right? So I have to push down hard. So I have to squeeze myself from the top down. The more I can do that, the greater force I can apply. Okay. Now, if doing that means that I have to sacrifice my ability to create a pressure at the bottom of the system. So we're going to say the anterior outlet of the pelvis, right? So my ability to leave the ground quickly is determined by how quickly I can change the direction of that anterior outlet, right? So you learn how to create more pressure by pushing down. The outlet gives way more, which makes it more difficult for the outlet to go back up against that pressure. So now when you try to jump, what do? You squeeze more from the top than you do from the bottom. And that takes away your capacity to leave the ground because you're going to spend more time on the ground, right? And so if you're narrow ISA, that would respond more favorably to a yield and an overcome of connective tissue behaviors, and you take that away because you got too much pressure coming down from the top, you can't jump anymore. And so this is over strength trained. This is how you know. It's like people say, how strong is strong enough? It's strong enough until you start to take away something that is more important. Because I'll give you a quick story. Had a kid, a baseball pitcher, went to college with like a 450 trap bar deadlift. Awesome. He eventually threw his fastball at 92 miles an hour. His trap bar deadlift slowly creeps up because of their strength training program in college. He's now trap bar deadlifting 675, and he now throws 87 and has elbow pain. So is there a correlation? I would hesitate to be absolutist about it, but I would say it's probably too much force production. Like, what did he sacrifice? Now he's pushing down to the ground. Now they took away his ability to turn. As a narrow ISA, they took away his ability to turn. Where does he have to? And Chris mentioned this earlier. It's like, I have to gain motion somewhere else, right? Because the rules are, I have to have enough time, I have to have enough expression of motion, and then I can perform my activity. Right. But too much force production because of the way that we produce force takes away something else that I needed. And that's kind of what you're expressing with your loss of vertical jump. Right. Yeah. So, but I got stronger. Yes, you did. Right. So your force production goes up, but how did you produce that force? And that's what we're talking about. This is why the structure matters. This is why the activities that you select matters. It's not that narrow ISA individuals can't deadlift. They're not going to be as good at it as somebody else is. They can still lift a lot of weight, but then what do they sacrifice?
Yeah.
And that's
right. I think another thing too that's important, because I was the same way, Joel. Like, deadlift was by far my better lift as an athlete, but I also have my ape index is crazy. I think I have like a 6'8" wingspan, and I'm 6'3". I'm 6'3". I have like 6'8" wingspan. Which made me really good at throwing frisbees and reaching around defenders and stuff like that, but it made me terrible like a lot of other things. But my program, the best, the most athletic I ever got, I had like a 38-inch vertical at one point, was doing like, do you remember like Barry Ross, like the track coach that had like the weightlifting? So his program was like, you were doing like high rack deadlift pulls where you drop it from the top and depth jumps. And that was like the majority of my training. And it was super heavy. I was leveraged. I had really long arms, so I was able to get in a very high position in terms of leverage. So it was still in the range of which I was strongest. And then the most important thing, kind of like Bill's saying, like if you think about the body as like a tube of toothpaste, if I'm always holding weight in my hands and squeezing hard from the top, like if I'm holding trap bar and doing lots and lots of reps, I squeeze everything down into the bottom of the toothpaste tube. I don't have the space anymore in order to get off of the ground and float and bounce off of the ground. and that's going to staple me to the floor. And as what your experience was, you lost vertical jump height. Whereas like when I was training doing high pulling activities, high pull or box deadlifts, and also pairing that with the depth jumps that allowed me to retain that behavior of like getting expansion so that I could get off of the ground. I think I could have just done the depth jumps, I think, looking back at it now, not done much of the deadlifting at all. It's like all I was doing was like tricking myself neurologically to allowing me to get a little bit more force production with the jump. But the jump was where it was at the whole time.
Yeah. I was going to say the same thing with me. I think I gravitated to deadlifts because my arms are so long. So it's like the ego thing you're good at.
Easy.
It's an easier initiation, but I also have just really good grip strength. Like, and so that also, it's almost like if you look at compensatory things that you can throw in the equation to help, that definitely helped too.
Do you have big hands?
Medium, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah. I think I just have, that's the one thing it's funny. I have like a grip meter I do before I train a lot of times. I have those like Captains of Crush thing. And one of the things, not to get on a huge rabbit trail, but I guess when having 3 kids now, I ask my mom like stories about like when I was a baby to kind of relate. And I was apparently like insanely skinny and underweight when I was born, but I had like such a strong grip. Like my mom's like, he's going to be okay. Like, or something. I don't know. It's like kind of funny to think, I guess I had that all the way back then. So, whatever the neural drive is to get that. But, what I was going to say was, well, one, it's funny. Every time I do a trap bar deadlift now, it's kind of been ruined for me a little bit in the sense, like, I just think, okay, is getting stronger at this, part of getting stronger at this past a certain level. I think initial easy gains you could get from a variety of places. But once you kind of hit a plateau, it's like, is further gains in this just because I'm learning to squeeze harder from the top? And you think about athletics nowadays where it's like, you have all sorts of different influences, and you have strength and conditioning obviously is now it's everywhere, which I think is a good thing, and it's continuing to learn and evolve. But it's like, okay, you're asked to do your sport, and that's one stressor, and then the other stressor is almost pushing you in the opposite direction. So to succeed, you have to succeed in spite of all these pressures. Some of you are good, some of them are good, some of them are working against you, and you think about how far is your ceiling. And the ultimate ceiling is kind of taking off those things that are forcing you to work against yourself. And so I think that's where I've gravitated now. To me, like the easiest path of least resistance is actually not really doing deadlifts, maybe like single leg variations that get my glutes. And then like a lot of like heels elevated sandbag squats is my jam. Like that's my thing. I feel like that's almost my point of least resistance at this point, or the front squat if I had an easy setup. But that's where I've kind of found my path over time.
Following your structure.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It feels right at that point, right? Because it's like it's almost perfect. Like you look at load distribution, you look at the way that you're executing. It actually creates a bias towards the external rotation, which again, your structural bias is towards external rotation, not towards internal rotation, like a wide ISA would be. Right. So the way that you produce force, it's not that you can't produce high forces. It's just that you have less time to do so. So exercises that emphasize the external rotation component would be more comfortable. And again, you will feel more successful in that execution.
I like to keep my center of gravity high off the ground and bouncy. So typically most of what I do for training is just go to a field and run like rolling sprints. Because it feels good, and there's not I don't have to, like, if I was to go a bench press and deadlift, I would feel it for 4 days afterwards. It's just, there's a cost. It's like what you're saying with the sandbag stuff. It just feels right. It's like, it feels good. There's no big setbacks involved. Like you could go play with your kids the day after and not be like, oh, I deadlifted yesterday.
That was the funny thing when I was in high school doing every vertical jump program in the world to try to jump higher. I found like deep back squats helped my 2-leg jump, but it always took me like 4 or 5 days before I could really jump off one leg again after doing them. I think, and I just looked at it as, oh, your muscles are sore, which they certainly were. But I think there was other things that were in that ecosystem that were at play, certainly. And I'm like you, Chris. like especially too, even like an isometric mid-thigh pull, like, and pairing that with plyos, or some of my best success with like French contraster setups is like what do you call it? Functional isometrics, where you just lift a heavy thing off the rack at a quarter squat for like 5 seconds and then go do whatever else. Like that stuff felt great. And so, that was definitely my jam too. I did want to get a little bit more into deadlifts, because like, okay, narrows and deadlifting, and I hopefully have time to touch on wides and same thing, or wides and squatting, let's flip the coin. But one thing that I'll start with an anecdote. I'm going to do all my own anecdotes, so I apologize. It's always the easiest for me from a reference. But when I, as a narrow, starting deadlifting, self-taught age 15 or 16, I tried to pick it up the regular way, and it just felt bad. I was like, this feels bad. So I just did sumo because it felt good. But it's interesting because it's like, well, that's a wide knees, right? But anyways, I'd like to dig in a little bit more to some of the variations and why they might feel good to a narrow, and then maybe getting in like single leg deadlifts or some alternatives that would be better for the way a narrow creates space in the back of their pelvis.
There's two reasons why the wider stance becomes, number one, more comfortable, and number two, more effective. So for the narrow ISA individual, and we kind of hit on this a little bit, is that you're going to be externally rotated bias, like your bias is towards external rotation versus internal rotation. So the wider stance moves you towards this ER bias. So where you apply force into the ground more effectively is actually away from midline. It doesn't mean that's your maximum internal rotation or your maximum force, but it is a place where you can go very easily to apply force. Therefore, that position tends to be favorable. We'll also see this. Anybody that is compressed anterior to posterior, so this could be the wide or the narrow, will also find, because what happens is that your sockets, if you will, your shoulder sockets, hip sockets, will become oriented more away from midline as you get compressed front to back. So the more high force activity that you perform, the more this orientation is going to take place. So it's not uncommon for, say, a wide ISA individual in their earlier training years to use, say, a conventional deadlift, and then as they progress, they find that, I need to start moving my feet away from midline into these sumo stances because it is infinitely more comfortable, but I can still apply force into those spaces. So this has a lot to do with where you have a space to apply force into the ground versus trying to jam somebody into a position that is contrary to their current structure.
That's the same with the reverse grip deadlift principle, right? Because I think you and Chris have talked about that. Powerlifters, it's like the more they go, eventually their deadlift grip, or their bench press grip changes over time. Is that the same principle?
We talked about it. I think Anthony Clark was one of those guys.
Yeah, Anthony Clark, yeah.
He's the guy that stands out in my mind because he was, number one, it was just amazing to watch, but it just stands to reason. It gets harder and harder. Like you get so turned away from midline that it gets harder and harder to bring your hands into these printed positions. So this, like, throw this one out there. So those of you that have evolved shoulder pain associated with your bench press, and then so what they do is they start with their thumb around the bar, and then they start using the thumbless grip because that's more comfortable, and then they start switching to dumbbells because that's more comfortable, and then eventually they run out of the fact that, well, I don't really have any more ER space available for me to execute these lifts because now my shoulder hurts too much. It's like that would be a representation of your progression moving away from midline. Like the deadlift would be no different. It's like, I started in a conventional stance, and then I just slowly widen my stance and turn toes away from midline. My grip now drops inside of my stance because that's the space that, number one, I'm more comfortable in. I can actually access that, and I can, like I said, still deliver force into the floor.
Jefferson deadlift. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, the more you, so I think the long story short there is the more you compress something front to back, the farther the joint orientations away from midline. So that's why like sumo becomes more comfortable for people, especially if you have a really athletic narrow, he's probably or she's probably experiencing a lot of compression from front to back. So like a sports sumo position might be the best thing for them because they're squeezing from front to back. Everything is just going away from midline. So you want to try to match up with that. Otherwise, you're just going to end up like pushing through the outsides of your feet and jamming your knees really close together.
Didn't Barry Ross have sumo deadlift in his program, Chris?
Yeah,
feel like
yeah. It was basically like you do whatever deadlift you need to pull the heaviest weight, and then you just drop it from the top. Because he did a lot of work with I can't remember specifically. She's an older female.
Allison Felix, was it?
Yeah, Felix. Yeah. He did a lot of work with her, I believe. And that was like all they did was like depth jumps and dropped deadlifts from the top.
Yeah.
I think it was just whatever was the most comfortable for her, which I think ended up being sumo deadlifts, which is, not a surprise now that we know what we know.
Yeah. So to reiterate, like a narrow is compressed front to back and has more space in the external range. That explains why that stance is more comfortable.
Everyone loses the ability to approximate the midline. Everything has to move away from midline. The more I crush it from front to back, and the more forward I get in my base of support. So I have to wide. You see it too with powerlifters too. Like they go so wide until they can't anymore. Like the rack is in the way, so their arms can't go any wider. They're touching the plates on the side of the bench press, or their feet are touching the plates in their sumo position. Yeah. They're so pancaked that's the only spot that those limbs can go.
The socket itself is actually oriented.
Yeah, the socket's point. Yeah.
So literally, like trying to bring your arm across your body horizontally becomes exceptionally difficult under that circumstance, because you're literally going against the socket orientation at that point. So a lot of the, like anterior shoulder pains, anterior hip pain, things like that starts to show up. Those are actually associated with the compressive strategies that create the socket orientation.
So to summarize a little bit, this is the way my mind kind of takes that, is a let's just say a compressed narrow. In the hinging world, they may need to go wide because that's just how they're compressed. That's the space they have available. But a squat, I mean, I know for me, I was just like narrow stance straight down. That just felt good. But if I hinged, that sumo tended to feel better. Is that kind of a good, I mean, it's an average, everyone's an N and one, right? But like in terms of the average mechanics of bilateral work?
The narrowest of narrows cannot even assume the appropriate pelvic or sacral position to quote unquote hinge. Like they can't.
Yeah.
So they have to, this is why you'll typically see them as they widen their stance, they become much more upright, and it starts to look like more of like a squat with a very wide stance versus take your wide ASA, who actually has that structural shape that is ideal for that middle range, where pulling where the deadlift starts is their ideal pelvic position. They're very good through the middle range of a wide stance box squat. Right, they're made for that, whereas the narrow ASA doesn't have that capacity, so they're actually moving away from midline because they need the external rotation. Because again, structurally, it's very difficult for them to apply the IR shapes.
Yeah, I think too that a lot of times when we're talking about high performing narrows and compressed narrows, a lot of athletes in general, but narrows especially, carry a lot of like anterior orientation. So the pelvis as one piece is sort of rolled forwards. So that stuff going straight down is not a reality for a lot of them. So they end up doing these sort of hingy looking movements. And I think that's where a lot of confusion comes from. Like, oh, well, this person's narrow and they're great at deadlifting. It's like, well, no, that's just the only way that they can move effectively because of how anteriorly oriented they are. Where if you give that person a goblet squat on a ramp, they kill it. Yes. And you're like, oh, well, like it's just the magic of this exercise. It's like, no, you just you created an environment and some constraints that allowed them to actually retain their structural superpowers. I think that's a point of confusion.
Yeah. I had back when I was coaching track at Wilmington College. It's funny how these things stick in your mind. This was when I was like 27. And I remember I had a narrow, I mean, I didn't know at the time, but a really top sprinter came in, just as narrow as could be and super bouncy. His feet, like just unbelievable bounce. And I remember we were trying to teach, deadlifts and RDLs, and I was even going through the stick hinge progression, and it's just so funny because every time he went forward, the bottom hand is just coming up like crazy. And I had to work so hard to get him to even do, and it's funny to even think of what an athlete might have to do in that situation to compensate to get into a good stick hinge who doesn't really have. I do think there's probably some space being created, but there's probably a lot of compensation going on too. So that always sticks in my head. And I remember thinking, should I even try to teach this guy how to deadlift? Maybe we should just squat. I don't know. It's just funny.
It's like, why?
Yeah.
We just thought that like hinging was so, it was like one of those categories, right? It's like push, pull, hinge, squat, single leg, double leg. Like you got to hit these, you got to check these boxes. And it's like, well, why don't I just do what they're good at doing? Allow them to excel at what they're good at. And just, as long as, Bill has kind of helped me realize this more than anyone, but as long as you have some type of like key performance indicators running in the background, it doesn't really matter what you do. As long as the ranges of motion that you expect are there, their perceived, pain and injury and their movement is to a certain degree that you want. And then their, 10 yards, flying 10s, vertical jump, whatever you use as a performance marker. If those things are still progressing, it doesn't really matter too much what you do in the weight room.
Yeah. So just to kind of finish this part off, because I want to talk wides and squatting briefly here.
Yeah.
But so if I have, let's just say a narrow who struggles with deadlift or conventional or alternatives, approaches or models to approaching the deadlift or, air quotes, the hinge with narrows who may struggle or just narrows in general. Do you guys have any like general models, just a starting point to say, hey, here's how we would teach or approach this type of motion for you?
Why don't
doing squats?
Are you talking about deadlifts for the
deadlifts for narrows, or single leg, double leg, whatever, any that motion. How do we approach that?
Well, again, so you have to say, well, why are you selecting an exercise? Like, what is the intention? And I think that gets lost, like tremendously lost, because people say like, oh, you have to deadlift. Well, why? What are you trying to do? Right? Okay. So a deadlift is very well designed to teach you to come to a stop and to produce high forces into the ground. That's what it's for. It's like, if I don't have that problem, I don't need to do that activity. Right? So if I have a high level sprinter that is great at applying force into the ground, I don't need to do a deadlift because he already has that capacity, right? We just have to decide what we're trying to do in that scenario. If you find that the position becomes virtually impossible, don't spend time on it, right? Because I can teach you to push into the ground rather aggressively. So if you did like a pull from above knee off boxes, okay, for a narrow, you are applying a tremendous amount of force into the ground with concentric orientation of the anterior outlet. So this is pressure from the bottom up, which is what we wanted in the first place. Okay. Within their structural design, because you are on the external rotation side of the bias in that position. So you're above the sticking point. So the sticking point would represent the greatest degree of internal rotation that has to be applied into the ground. It would require, like, to be the master of this, it would require a pelvis that can assume an IR position, which would have a nutated sacrum. Well, if I'm a narrow, I got news for you. You're not going to be able to bias yourself towards that structure. But if I go just above that, right, that's where they applied the strongest application of IR as a narrow ISA. So by modifying the activity, so I'm pulling from my higher position, I'm actually applying force into the ground in a space that I actually have access to under that circumstance. So we would tend to say that they have a smaller space to apply the internal rotation in. It has to be biased towards what we would term a late propulsive strategy. So it's on the other side of where a wide would have the maximum force production. Okay, so it's a little bit higher off the ground. This would be we had a great high jumper when I was at Purdue many years ago before you guys were born. But he would do partial reps and slender as all get out, but only 5'8", right? But he jumped 7'4", I think, which was it was amazing to see. But all partials, high pulls. Partial leg crosses, like near straightening of the knees, right? All levels. And he did this intuitively, right? It wasn't something like, oh, I understand it. Like he had no idea what it was. He just knew that when I do this, this works really, really well. And so that's how we want to look at this. We don't want to say like, how do I get you to deadlift? It's like, okay, you're just not well designed, right? If I need you to pull off the floor, yeah, I can modify this. Okay, so we're going to take a really wide stance. We're going to put you in a sumo. Maybe we'll elevate the bar a little bit. Maybe I'm going to use a trap bar because it's already elevated, right? But I would prefer to say, why am I doing this in the first place? Like I'm trying to create a pressurization internally that allows me to push up. Like, so I can push down in the ground. So I go in the opposite direction. So Sir Isaac, right? Equal on opposite, right? So I need to be able to push in the ground aggressively. So I go in the other direction. And that means the outlet has to be able to go up. So let's put them in an advantageous position to do that. And then we can start to raise the force production in that space. And now we'll see the transfer into the event.
Yeah, I think so I'll offer the perspective of some listeners right now who are screaming at their radios, their AM FM radios that they're listening to this podcast on. So a lot of people are going to say that, I've had these conversations with Bill already, but I know he has an answer for this. People are going to talk about deadlifting and RDLs as this posterior chain development, like the best way to work the hamstrings, the best way to work the glutes, like, and that being this important, crucial part of like having safe mechanics when sprinting or whatever. But I know Bill will have a response for this, but why is that not really matter at all, Bill? The posterior chain development thing.
Because it has to do with the shape of the pelvis as you're applying force into the ground, right? A narrow ISA individual does not have the same shape changing capacity towards internal rotation. So where they actually apply the greatest degree of force is directly below their center of gravity, right? It's a very small space. This is why you'll see really high level sprinters that have a bias towards a funnel shaped configuration, but a narrow ISA, right? Because they need to stay off the ground longer. The narrow has that mechanical advantage. They need to produce a high level of force into the ground in a very small space over a very short period of time. That makes that structure ideal, right? And so, yeah, you can talk to me about muscle activity and such. Great, happy for you. But if you can't produce the pressure into the ground, and so what those hamstrings are actually doing are actually twisting an element of the pelvis so it can produce force into the ground. So it does produce the highest pressure internally because that's how you apply pressure into the ground. So it's not the muscle force per se that's moving you across the ground. It's your ability to produce pressure into the ground, right? And so I can do that in any number of ways. Like that does not make that exercise essential nor ideal based on physical structure, right? It just means that I got to find a way to produce the force.
Yeah. I think that people tend to get caught up in hearing these things and thinking that, well, the EMG from an RDL or the development I see in athletes' hamstrings and glutes is better with this exercise, which is too anecdotal to start with. But also what they're not looking at from my experience is that if I'm having athletes that are having problems with pulling hamstrings when they're sprinting, and I'm not addressing sprinting mechanics and the coordinative, and we talked about like motor learning and stuff like that. If I'm not talking about the technical aspects of what they're doing and how they're injuring themselves, I'm missing the forest for the trees here, because it's like, it's not a deadlifting problem. It's a hamstring strain from a sprint related issue or a propulsion related issue. So it doesn't matter what exercise I use if I'm not addressing the actual root of the problem to begin with.
Yeah, I think that is something that ultimately, like an athlete's development, what muscles are big, what are not, it's how they move in their thousands of reps they do on the field all the time.
Yeah.
Much more than, hey, we're going to do 3 sets of 10 of this thing. I mean, that does a little, but compared to what you're doing all the time, I think it, especially at like typical athletes, that's the thing to look at, and that tells the story of how you're using what.
Right. Strongmen have some of the biggest calves in the world, but they're not doing calf raises. It's because they're carrying 800-pound cars over like 400 yards. That's what it's just, the adaptation to the imposed demands, right? It's not about what exercise to do in the gym.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I probably that even that topic brings up a lot on. All right, well, let's talk hamstrings and let's talk dynamic development. And I do want to keep this in the container of the big lifts and the wides and the narrows. So before I probably get another 3 questions to put down, would love to get into the polar opposite for at least hopefully 10 minutes if you guys have that, which would be just wides and squatting. Okay, so we talked narrows and deadlifting and hinging. Let's talk wides and squatting. So thoughts with what should we expect? How teaching wides to squat? What should the goblet or the sandbag squat to a narrow? What are we talking about with a wide ISA? Thoughts on there, or maybe Chris, if you want to help frame up that question, I certainly would appreciate your help there. But
yeah, I mean, it's tough getting past having like structural archetypes dictate which lifts you're better at is hard for people because they have all their experiential knowledge and they think that, oh, well, I have this narrow person and they were a great deadlifter, and it's hard for people to get past that. So it's like understanding what the structural archetypes allow you to do. I think we sort of touched on that a little bit, but maybe talking a bit more about how the strategies from like a narrow or top down versus a wide being bottom up sort of predicates what they're good at in the weight room, Bill. I'm not sure.
Well, it's if you break a squat down into 3 pieces, okay, top third, middle third, bottom third. Wide ISAs are going to have their greatest success through that middle range because of this is the highest pressure. So use the sticking point as a representation plus or minus about 30 degrees of movement. That's going to be the strongest representation of IR. It's going to be this highest pressure demand. It's like, okay, everybody's done this that has had enough weight on the bar at some point in time in their career where they squatted just a little too deep, right? And then they're pushing back up and they push up, and everything slows down, and they come to a stop, and the spotter's looking at the pretty girl across the room, and they're not paying attention to your squat, and you go the wrong way. And then you end up going down. Okay, so why did that fail in the first place? Because you have to physically change the shape of the pelvis. You have to physically change the shape of the anterior outlet to be able to create enough pressure from the bottom up to push through that range. Once you get above it, and everybody's had that experience, it's like you go through the sticking point, and then you get above that, and it's suddenly easy, right? Because you're not going the same direction. Okay, that sticking point, the reason it's called a sticking point is because it's a transitional behavior. It's a shape change in the pelvis. It's a positional change in the anterior outlet. It is a higher demand to maintain the internal pressures. Because think about it, if I put a bar on your back, what did I just do? I instantly created the amount of pressure that's pushing you into the ground. I instantly created the demand for you to squeeze your body in on itself to hold the weight up, because you have to make an incompressible cylinder to stack that weight on in the first place. Now you need the bottom of the cylinder to be able to push up to come through the sticking point. So a wide ISA will typically have a more favorable representation of that middle range. It doesn't mean that they can't squat deep. It doesn't mean that they are going to be worse in Olympic weightlifting, because there's plenty of wide ISAs, and you look at the super heavyweight classes that can actually access these positions. They're going to make adjustments in their squat though, because they would be hard pressed to not be able to create enough external rotation to be able to sit down into that deep squat, because that's where they're going to have the trouble. They're going to have to rely on compensatory structural adaptations, compensatory strategies to hit the bottom of the squat, right? Doesn't mean they can't do it, just means this is how they're going to do it, right? If you were to look at powerlifting, makes just a great example. It's like, again, the heavier lifters in powerlifting all tend to be wide ISA structurally. And again, that's one of the reasons why they're biased towards powerlifting as a successful endeavor, because structurally they're well designed for it. But if you were to look at, like, say, if you were working on trying to increase your max effort squat, you're going to find like the use of chains versus bands as one of these additives for the squat as far as improving your force output. A wide ISA is going to be biased more towards using the chains, because as the chains are loaded onto the bar during the squat, they actually prolong the duration of that middle range of the squat. So it actually teaches you to create even a higher force production through that range, right? Whereas with your narrows, because they are biased towards more the top or the very bottom of the squat, they respond more to the elastic additive resistance, right? And so again, it's this middle range, and again, that makes you a great deadlifter or a wide stance box squatter or something along those lines. If you get those pictures in your head, and like I said, it doesn't mean you can't do the other. It just means that you're going to be better at that range.
Yeah. And based on structure too, you're going to have a difference. It could just be a difference of like, using elevation of the feet on ramps or bar position. The wides are going to have a better time. They're going to have an easier time with like a back squat than a narrow is, just based on structure. They're going to have an easier time squatting in flat feet based on what their structure allows them. The positions, like Bill's saying, like in order to approximate that more orthogonal IR heavy position, they're more suited for that. And you're not going to necessarily want to have that person squat ass to grass, because there's no point in them doing it. It just doesn't match with their structure.
Does Hatfield, I wonder if the Hatfield squat was born out of helping a wide ISA squat better. Any thoughts on that?
It shifts your center of mass for sure. It allows you to drop straight down. It allows you to delay yourself, because the wides they're not as good as delaying forward motion. They just they want to accelerate forwards. So if you can delay anyone by having them reach out in front, the Hatfield squats where you're holding onto the rack, right?
Yeah, or like handles or something in front of you.
Yeah, handles or something. Yeah, it just allows you to like you create more space to allow you to move up and down within the base of support.
Get you below the sticking point.
Yeah. Gives you the space to get where you couldn't before without compensation.
Yeah. So basically, I know a lot of people say, I think I've heard you guys talk about this too, like everyone should be able to squat ass to grass, and that's the gold standard of squatting. And it makes me, I had a little internal chuckle, because I think of like the whole like knees over toes thing. It's like, would that work if you're a wide, the widest wide trying to do a knees over toes?
Well, it doesn't work for the people that I'm making air quotes works for. It's you're jamming someone into the end ranges, and you're basically mechanistically putting the knee at risk of like tearing the posterior horn. Tell me if I'm mistaken, Bill, but that's basically the position you would be in if you wanted to blow the posterior of your meniscus.
Yeah, it would be the compressed position.
Yeah.
If you don't have access to that space.
Right. Yeah. Which a lot of people don't. And we have experience. We hear secondhand and third hand from people who are rehabbing professional baseball players who got really into that stuff in the off season, and now their knees hurt. It's not, you don't hear about that because it doesn't sell programs on YouTube, but
yeah,
that's the reality, right? It's like you can't trying to jam square pegs into round holes. You don't usually get really good results.
Yeah, I think it just shows the value of just spending time, whatever your own archetype, or even time for an athlete to be like, hey, here's some things, squat and find a way that feels good with these things, and like,
yeah. And so many people don't use intuition. They think like, the whole, I think that one of the main things we, in the beginning of our podcast, was talking about like the whole no pain, no gain thing. It's like this stuff, your experience with sandbag squatting, it just feels better. Your knees don't hurt for 3 days. Your glutes don't hurt so much that you can't sit on the toilet anymore. It's like, you don't have to have that. It's not a necessary part of training. If you want to get better at a specific task, like you have to hone in on getting better at that thing and not be so worried about like what your trap bar deadlift numbers are, how much you can pull off the ground.
Yeah. And ultimately it's like, are you running faster, jumping higher, staying healthy, throwing harder?
Yeah.
And then everything else.
Are you playing well? Like what's your stat line like for this season? Like, how are you doing out there? Yeah.
I like the, I'll just in closing here, I Bill, what you said about, this helps me to remember. I'm always trying to think about ways to help myself remember, but like the rubber band makes me think of an elastic. So it's like, okay, if I was going to put something on a squat, like light rubber band or something like that. And then wide, it's like the chain. When I was 21, I did all sorts of dumb stuff. Like my track coach gave us the program, and I did some good ideas that felt intuitive and good, and some things that were dumb. I was like, oh, this person does this, so I should do it. I remember 3 weeks before the national meet, just saying that, I'm like, I was so stupid back then. But I decided to put the big green bands, they're like the ones that are 1.5 inches thick, on like 185 for squatting, and just did deep squats, like, I don't know what, 3 sets of 6 or 4 sets of 6. And I was sore for a whole week and a half, I want to say, from that. And then I was funny because I remember at the national meet, the way I was high jumping at the national meet, like I could jog in and take a couple of gathers and jump really high. But when it came time for the full approach, where it's that IR window is way, way smaller, I wasn't really a whole lot better. It's just kind of funny. I don't know. Like, I don't think that one squat session had all the world to do with that, but that definitely progressed that way the more I kind of did that kind of thing. So yeah, it's just kind of funny. I needed lighter bands and probably partial squats. That would have been a little bit better idea, I think.
Release it.
Yeah. So just to cap of like the wide ice hand squatting, a lot of it's just the sticking point and being aware of that and not feeling like you have to squat ass to grass beyond that. It's like just intuitively working with the sticking point of what they can do. Any comments or addition on that? Just because I want to kind of close that section with anything.
We just have to appreciate the whole premise is just appreciating the constraints and what the actual options are. And I think, and your intentions. It's like, so what problem are you trying to solve? How does this person solve that problem? And then your exercise selection just sort of falls into place. And then that becomes like, okay, what variation of a squat, if I need to do a squat, what variation of a squat would be best under this circumstance? Do I need to pull off the floor? Okay, if I need to pull from a static position, does it have to be the floor, or can it be elevated under this circumstance? Because my structural says I'm much better at doing it that way, right? Instead of saying that we have to do this exercise, let's actually figure out what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and then what best solves that based on the constraints, and then based on the parameters of the context of the exercise.
Yeah. I was going to say too, at the bands, I was like, I did the deep squat with the big old heavy bands. I think a partial with the light ones would have been so much better for me. But yeah, I think that's what makes this fun too, is that not every athlete in the gym is going to have, like, you're not going to say, hey, this is my favorite squatting exercise as a coach. You all do it, like just to see the little differences and be able to work with that. I think is part of the enjoyable part of all this. It makes it fun.
It is fun.
All right, closing. I know you guys have a couple of things going on. I mentioned the Reconsider podcast you do, and then I know you have the UHP network. Yeah, whatever you guys would like to share about that. I know people would love to hear about it. I think it's been, like I said, I've been serial listening to the podcast. I've gotten on the network. So yeah, please explain before we take off here.
So is Bill's gonna force me to talk because he doesn't wanna...
You're about shameless promotion.
Yeah, I'll have this. Okay. So what we got? So the Reconsider podcast, like Joel was saying, we also have a program that's sort of general population facing, which is called Recon, which is basically a program we created for people that are continuing to experience setbacks when they try to train. So they get back into training, they rehab themselves, they're cleared medically and from a physical therapist, but every time they hit the 6th week of their training cycle and they do this exercise for this many reps, their back starts to bother them again or something like that. So it's taking a few steps back, kind of teaching people based on archetype how to move, how they should manage gravity, working on shape change, and allowing them to progressively get back to doing the things that they like to do without experiencing those setbacks. And that's more for like the general population people. We have some trainers and therapists that use it with their clients and athletes. We have some that use it for their own training to sort of like learn through this experiential manner. And then the other thing we've got going on is the UHP network, which is basically a social network created to teach Bill's model. It's uhp.network is the address for that. I think we have like 1,600 members at this point, and there's free courses there. There's a forum once you complete those courses to discuss questions about the model. There is a premium area where we have 300 therapists and coaches that get together, work on case studies, talk about applying aspects of the model. Bill and I put out content every single week. We have office hours and live calls, all sorts of great stuff. And if you want to go and check that out, you can even see that premium stuff. There's a free 3-day trial for that if anyone is interested. Anything else you want to add to that, Bill?
Just uhp.network.
uhp.network. And I will say that, it's been great because we get a lot of feedback from people that are like, oh, I heard about this through this person and this person who told me about this person. It's like, this is the place to get this model from. This is where to learn this stuff from. And instead of like trying to learn from someone that learned about this from someone else, instead of playing that ridiculous telephone game, get it from the source. You can ask the person who created this model questions directly. And it's been great so far. We're in the pretty fledgling stages of it, but it's going to grow into something pretty great, I think.
Yeah. Well, so far, I'm really glad that you two have been putting out the work that you have. So I've been learning a ton, and it was awesome to have both of you on the podcast today. It's always good. So really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joel.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I wanted to let you know about one more opportunity as it relates to Bill's model and the UHP network. There's going to be a free sprinting and the UHP model webinar, and that's going to be on October 1st at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Head to uhp.network to sign up. Thanks again for listening. Appreciate you all, and I'll see you next week.